Captain Jake Morrison stared out the window of the USS Liberty as the massive alien ship grew larger in front of them. The Zephyrian vessel was 3 times the size of any human ship he had ever seen. Its golden hull gleamed in the light of the nearby star, and strange symbols covered its surface from top to bottom. Jake had fought aliens before, but he had never tried to talk to them. Fighting was much easier than talking. "Captain Morrison, we need to go over the rules one more time," Lieutenant Amy Fisher said as she walked up behind him. She held a thick tablet filled with notes about alien customs. Amy had been studying the Zephyrians for months, learning everything she could about their culture and their ways of doing things. Jake turned away from the window and looked at the young officer. Amy was smart and dedicated, but she had never been in a real fight. She believed that following rules and being polite could solve any problem. Jake knew better. Sometimes you had to be ready to fight to get what you wanted. "I know the rules, Amy. Don't touch anything sacred. Don't speak unless spoken to. Bow 3 times when I meet the Emperor. Never put my feet on furniture. Did I miss anything?" Jake's voice showed he was tired of hearing the same things over and over. "This is serious, Captain. The Zephyrians have been around for thousands of years. They control more star systems than any other species in the galaxy. If we mess this up, they could destroy every human colony in space." Amy's voice was worried. She knew how important these talks were. Dr. Carl Bennett walked into the room carrying his own set of notes. Carl was older than both Jake and Amy, and he had spent his whole life studying different alien species. He was the closest thing humanity had to an expert on the Zephyrians. "The docking will begin in 10 minutes, Carl said. "Jake, I need you to understand something. The Zephyrians see themselves as the most advanced species in the galaxy. They think all other species are like children who need to be taught how to behave. They have never had anyone refuse to follow their rules." Jake nodded but did not say anything. He had read all the reports about the Zephyrians. They had conquered dozens of other species, but they did not usually destroy them completely. Instead, they made them follow Zephyrian laws and pay tribute to the Empire. The Zephyrians saw this as being kind and generous. "The Emperor will test you," Carl continued. "He will try to make you feel small and unimportant. He will speak in riddles and expect you to understand hidden meanings. Whatever you do, do not lose your temper." Commander Lisa Hayes entered the room. She was the captain of the USS Liberty and had been Jake's friend for many years. They had served together in the war against the Corvan pirates, and she was one of the few people who truly understood him. "We are ready to dock," Lisa announced. "The Zephyrian escort ships are guiding us to the main landing bay. Jake, their translator is already waiting for you. His name is Valtar, and he speaks our language very well." Jake looked around the room at his team. These 3 people were supposed to help him save humanity from a war that could destroy everything humans had built among the stars. The Zephyrians had already taken control of 5 human mining colonies in the Kepler sector. They claimed the colonies were built on sacred Zephyrian ground, even though humans had been mining there for 10 years. "Remember," Amy said one more time, "the negotiations will take place in the Emperor's throne room. Everything there is considered sacred. The table is carved from a single piece of crystal that is over 1,000 years old. The Zephyrians believe it has special powers." Jake had heard this before, but he listened anyway. The Zephyrians seemed to think everything they owned was sacred or special. Their whole culture was built around ceremony and tradition. Every action had to be done in exactly the right way, or it was considered an insult. The ship shook slightly as it connected with the Zephyrian docking bay. Jake could hear the sound of machinery as the 2 ships locked together. Soon, he would be walking into the most important meeting in human history. "Are you ready?" Lisa asked. Jake looked down at his uniform. It was clean and pressed, with all his medals and ribbons in the right places. He had fought in 6 major battles and had never lost a single engagement. But today he felt nervous in a way he had never felt before. In battle, he knew what to do. Here, he had to follow rules he did not understand and be polite to people who thought humans were inferior. "As ready as I can be," Jake replied. The four humans walked through the corridors of the USS Liberty toward the docking bay. Other crew members watched them go, knowing that the future of humanity might depend on how well Jake could control his temper during the next few hours. The docking bay doors opened with a soft hiss. Beyond them lay a corridor that belonged to the Zephyrians. The walls were covered with the same golden material as the outside of the ship, and the air smelled different. It was not unpleasant, but it reminded Jake that he was no longer in human territory. Two Zephyrian guards stood waiting for them. They were tall and thin, with skin that looked like it was made of pale crystals. Their eyes were large and completely black, and they wore robes that seemed to flow like water. They did not carry weapons that Jake could see, but something about them made him think they were dangerous. "Welcome, humans," one of the guards said in perfect English. "I am Veltar, translator for His Supreme Majesty, Emperor Zolthek. You will follow me to the throne room." Jake nodded and stepped forward. Amy, Carl, and Lisa followed close behind him. The corridor was longer than Jake had expected, and the walls were covered with pictures that seemed to move when he was not looking directly at them. "The Emperor is very old," Veltar said as they walked. "He has ruled the Zephyrian Empire for over 300 years. He has never met with humans before. You should consider this a great honor." "We do," Amy said quickly. Before Jake could respond, they passed through several more corridors, each one more elaborate than the last. Jake saw other Zephyrians walking through the halls, all of them tall and graceful, all of them dressed in flowing robes. Some of them stopped to stare at the humans as they passed. Jake could not tell if they were curious or hostile. Finally, they reached a set of massive doors that must have been 20 feet tall. The doors were covered with more of the moving pictures, and Jake could see that they told some kind of story. Veltar stopped and turned to face the humans. "Beyond these doors is the throne room of Emperor Zolthek," the translator said. "You will bow 3 times when you see the Emperor. You will not speak unless he gives you permission. You will not touch anything without permission. You will not sit until invited to do so. Do you understand?" Jake looked at the massive doors and thought about the 5 human colonies that were now under Zephyrian control. He thought about the thousands of human families who had been forced to leave their homes. He thought about the Zephyrian ultimatum that had brought him here. "I understand," Jake said. The doors began to open. The throne room was the largest indoor space Jake had ever seen. The ceiling stretched up so high that it disappeared into shadows above. Golden pillars lined the walls, each one carved with more of the moving pictures that seemed to tell ancient stories. The floor was made of polished stone that reflected light like a mirror. At the far end of the room sat Emperor Zolthek on his throne. The throne itself was carved from a single piece of white crystal that seemed to glow with its own inner light. The Emperor was tall even while sitting, and his crystalline skin shifted colors slowly from pale blue to silver to white. His robes were made of material that looked like liquid starlight, flowing and changing as he moved. Jake had seen pictures of Zephyrians before, but meeting the Emperor in person was different. The alien ruler seemed ancient and powerful, like a mountain that had been standing for thousands of years. His black eyes were fixed on the human delegation as they entered the room. "Remember the protocol?" Amy whispered behind Jake as they walked across the vast floor toward the throne. Dozens of Zephyrian courtiers stood along the walls, all of them dressed in elaborate robes. Some carried staffs topped with glowing crystals. Others wore crowns made of twisted metal. All of them watched the humans with expressions that Jake could not read. When they reached the proper distance from the throne, Veltar raised his hand. "You may now greet His Supreme Majesty," the translator said. Jake stepped forward and bowed once, twice, 3 times, just as Amy had taught him. The other humans followed his lead. Jake felt awkward and clumsy compared to the graceful movements of the Zephyrians around him. Emperor Zolthek spoke in a voice that sounded like wind chimes mixed with distant thunder. The words were in the Zephyrian language, full of sounds that human throats were not designed to make. Veltar listened carefully, then translated. His Supreme Majesty welcomes the representatives of the human species to his sacred vessel. He notes that this is the first time creatures from your world have been granted the honor of standing in his presence. He hopes that you will prove worthy of this great privilege. Jake bit back his first response. The Emperor was already making it clear that he saw humans as inferior beings who should be grateful for any attention at all. Amy had warned him about this, but hearing it still made his jaw clench. Please tell His Majesty that we are honored to be here, Jake said, trying to keep his voice steady. Veltar translated, and the Emperor replied with another long speech full of flowery language. His Supreme Majesty says that the harmony of the spheres has been disturbed by the actions of your species. The sacred mining worlds of the Kepler sector have been defiled by crude human machinery. The Emperor wishes to restore balance to the galaxy, but this requires the cooperation of all lesser species. Jake felt his temper rising. The sacred mining worlds had been empty rocks when humans first arrived. There had been no Zephyrian settlements, no markers, no signs that anyone had ever lived there. The humans had spent 10 years building colonies, mining facilities and homes for thousands of families. The humans have been mining in the Kepler sector for 10 years, Jake said carefully. We established our colonies legally, according to galactic law. We were not aware that the Zephyrians had any claim to those worlds. The Emperor's response was longer this time, and Jake noticed that the ruler's skin shifted to a darker blue color as he spoke. Veltar looked nervous as he translated. His Supreme Majesty says that galactic law is a crude concept created by younger species who do not understand the true nature of the universe. The Zephyrian Empire has existed for over 5,000 years. Our ancestors walked among the stars when your species was still learning to make fire. The sacred worlds have belonged to the Empire since before your son was born. Carl Bennett stepped forward slightly. If I may ask, Your Majesty, why were there no Zephyrian settlements or markers on these worlds when we arrived? The Emperor's skin darkened further, and several of the courtiers made sounds that might have been gasps or warnings. Veltar hesitated before translating Carl's question. The Emperor's reply was sharp and quick. His Supreme Majesty says that the sacred worlds were left pure and untouched as a sign of respect for the ancient spirits that dwell there. Only primitive species would think that ownership must be marked with crude physical signs. Jake looked around the throne room at all the elaborate decorations. The golden pillars, the carved crystal table that sat between the Emperor's throne and where the humans were standing. Everything in the room was designed to show wealth and power. The idea that the Zephyrians would leave valuable mining worlds completely unmarked seemed hard to believe. We understand the Emperor's position, Jake said, but our people have built homes and lives on those worlds. 5 colonies with over 50,000 people. We cannot simply abandon them. The Emperor spoke again, and this time his voice was colder. When Veltar translated, his own voice shook slightly. His Supreme Majesty says that the humans have proven themselves to be a stubborn and unreasonable species. However, he is willing to show mercy. The human colonies may remain, but they will now operate under Zephyrian law. All mining operations will be overseen by Imperial officers. Half of all resources extracted will be sent to the Empire as tribute. Human colonists will be required to attend daily ceremonies to show proper respect for the sacred spirits of the worlds. Jake felt the blood drain from his face. The Emperor was not offering a compromise. He was demanding complete surrender. The tribute alone would make the mining operations worthless, and forcing human colonists to participate in alien religious ceremonies was completely unacceptable. Your Majesty, Jake said, struggling to keep his voice level. With respect, what you are proposing is not a negotiation. It is a surrender. The human government cannot agree to these terms. The Emperor's skin shifted to a deep purple color, and he leaned forward on his throne. His reply was harsh and commanding. His Supreme Majesty says that humans do not seem to understand their position in the galaxy, Veltar translated, his voice barely above a whisper. The Zephyrian Empire controls over 200 star systems. Our fleet numbers in the thousands. Your species controls perhaps 20 systems and has fewer than 100 ships capable of interstellar combat. This is not a negotiation between equals. This is a generous offer from a superior species to a primitive one. Jake looked at Amy, who was frantically taking notes. Her face was pale, and he could see that she was beginning to understand what he had suspected from the beginning. The Zephyrians had not invited them here to negotiate. They had invited them here to surrender. A new voice spoke from among the courtiers. Jake turned to see a Zephyrian who was taller than the others, with skin that gleamed like polished metal. Unlike the other courtiers, this one wore what looked like military insignia on his robes. That is General Kethmar, Veltar whispered, the Emperor's chief military advisor. The general spoke in the Zephyrian language, gesturing toward the human delegation. His tone was harsh and dismissive. General Kethmar suggests that humans may be too primitive to understand the concept of civilized surrender. Veltar translated reluctantly. He says that perhaps your species would be better served by accepting a more direct form of imperial guidance. The general continued speaking, and Jake noticed that several of the courtiers were nodding in agreement. Whatever the general was saying, it was finding support among the Emperor's advisors. The general believes that humans should be classified as a client species rather than an independent civilization, Veltar continued. Client species are not permitted to make their own decisions about expansion or resource extraction. All such decisions are made by imperial governors appointed by the Emperor. Jake felt his hands clench into fists. The general was suggesting that humanity should become slaves to the Zephyrian Empire. Every human colony, every human ship, every human decision would be subject to alien approval. Emperor Zolthek spoke again, and Jake could see approval in the ruler's black eyes as he looked at his general. His Supreme Majesty finds merit in General Kethmar's suggestion, Veltar translated. Perhaps the time for negotiation has passed. Perhaps what is needed is a demonstration of imperial authority. The Emperor raised one crystalline hand, and the massive doors at the far end of the throne room began to close. The sound of the massive doors closing echoed through the throne room like thunder. Jake watched as his only exit disappeared, leaving the human delegation trapped in the chamber with the Emperor and his court. The message was clear. The humans would not leave until they accepted whatever terms the Zephyrians offered. Your Majesty, Jake said, his voice cutting through the silence. Closing the doors seems unnecessary. We came here to talk, not to be held prisoner. Emperor Zolthek's skin shifted to a darker shade of purple as Veltar translated Jake's words. The ruler's response was cold and sharp. His Supreme Majesty says that the doors are closed to prevent interruption during this historic moment. Veltar translated. He wishes to ensure that the human delegation fully understands the generosity of the imperial offer before making any hasty decisions. Jake looked around the throne room. The Zephyrian courtiers had moved closer, forming a loose circle around the humans. None of them appeared to be armed, but Jake had learned never to assume aliens were helpless just because they did not carry obvious weapons. Amy stepped closer to Jake's side. "Captain," she whispered, "we need to be very careful here. If we anger them further, they might decide that diplomacy is pointless." Carl Bennett was studying the Emperor's face, trying to read the aliens' expressions. "The color changes in their skin seem to indicate emotional states," he said quietly. "Purple appears to be anger or displeasure. The darker it gets, the more upset they are." Commander Lisa Hayes moved to Jake's other side. As a ship captain, she was trained to recognize dangerous situations. "Jake, this feels like a trap. They never intended to negotiate with us as equals." General Kethmar spoke again, his metallic skin gleaming in the light of the crystal throne. His words were addressed to the Emperor, but his black eyes remained fixed on Jake the entire time. "General Kethmar is recommending immediate action," Veltar translated. "He suggests that the human colonies should be occupied by imperial forces within the next solar cycle. He believes that swift action will prevent any organized resistance." Jake felt his temper beginning to rise. The general was talking about invading human colonies while the human delegation stood helpless in the same room. It was like planning a murder in front of the victim's family. And what happens to the human colonists? Jake asked, his voice growing harder. The general's reply was dismissive, as if Jake had asked about the fate of insects. General Kethmer says that compliant humans will be relocated to designated areas where they can be properly supervised. Veltar translated. Those who resist will be dealt with according to Imperial law. Jake knew what that meant. The compliant humans would become slaves and the resistant ones would be killed. The Zephyrians were not offering mercy or compromise. They were offering slavery or death. Emperor Zolthek spoke again, and Jake noticed that the ruler's skin had returned to its normal pale blue color. The Emperor seemed pleased with his general's suggestions. His Supreme Majesty believes that General Kethmer's plan has merit, Veltar translated. However, he is willing to offer one final opportunity for peaceful resolution. If the human delegation agrees to the Imperial terms immediately, the occupation can be conducted with minimal violence. Jake looked at his team. Amy was pale and shaking. Carl was frantically scribbling notes, trying to find some cultural angle that might help them escape the trap. Lisa was watching the exits, calculating their chances of fighting their way out. What exactly are the Imperial terms? Jake asked, though he already knew the answer would be unacceptable. The Emperor's response was long and detailed, delivered in the same flowery language he had used throughout the meeting. But the meaning was clear even before Veltar finished. Translating. His Supreme Majesty offers the following terms, the translator said. All human colonies in the Kepler sector will be placed under Imperial administration. All human military vessels will be surrendered to Imperial forces. All human expansion into new star systems will require Imperial approval. All human trade with other species will be conducted through Imperial intermediaries. In exchange, the Empire will provide protection and guidance to help humanity reach its full potential as a client species. Jake felt something cold settle in his stomach. The Emperor was demanding the complete surrender of human independence. Every human ship, every human colony, every human decision would be subject to alien approval. Humanity would cease to exist as a free species. And if we refuse? Jake asked. General Kethmer answered before the Emperor could speak. His voice was harsh and full of threat. If you refuse, the Imperial fleet will visit every human world, Veltar translated. Your cities will burn, your ships will be destroyed. Your people will learn the price of defying the Empire. The survivors will serve as a warning to other species who might be tempted to resist Imperial authority. The throne room fell silent. Jake could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. The Zephyrians were not bluffing. They had the ships and the power to carry out their threats. The human fleet was strong, but it was not strong enough to fight the entire Zephyrian Empire. Amy grabbed Jake's arm. Captain, we have to consider this carefully. If we refuse, they could destroy every human colony in space. Millions of people could die. If we agree, those same people become slaves, Jake replied. What kind of life is that? Carl looked up from his notes. There might be a middle ground. Perhaps we could negotiate a treaty that gives the Zephyrians some of what they want while preserving human autonomy. Emperor Zolthek had been listening to the humans' whispered conversation. Now he spoke again, his voice carrying a tone of final authority. His Supreme Majesty grows tired of human delays and excuses, Veltar translated. The Imperial offer is generous and final. You have until the next chime of the ceremonial bell to accept or refuse. That is approximately 10 minutes in your time measurement. Jake looked up at the Emperor on his crystal throne. The alien ruler sat perfectly still, his black eyes fixed on the human delegation. Around the room, the courtiers waited in silence for the humans to make their decision. 10 minutes to decide the fate of our entire species, Jake said quietly. Captain, Amy said, we don't have any choice. If we refuse, they will destroy everything. At least if we accept, our people will survive as slaves, Jake replied. Would you want to live as a slave, Amy? Would you want your children to grow up knowing they could never make their own choices, Lisa spoke up from behind him. Jake, she's right about one thing. We can't fight the entire Zephyrian Empire. Their fleet is too large, their technology too advanced. This might be the only way to save our people. Carl nodded reluctantly. The Zephyrians have conquered dozens of other species. Some of those species are still alive, still maintaining their cultures under imperial supervision. It's not ideal, but it's better than extinction. Jake looked around the throne room again. The golden pillars, the elaborate decorations, the crystal table carved from a single piece of ancient stone. Everything here was designed to show the power and wealth of the Zephyrian Empire. The message was clear. Resistance was futile, but Jake had spent his entire adult life fighting against impossible odds. He had won battles that should have been lost, survived situations that should have killed him. He had never surrendered to anyone, and he was not about to start now. The ceremonial bell chimed somewhere in the distance, marking the passage of time. Jake had maybe 8 minutes left to make the most important decision in human history. General Kethmore spoke again, his voice full of satisfaction. He seemed to believe that the humans had already made their choice. General Kethmore says that he is already preparing the occupation forces, Veltar translated. He assumes that reasonable humans will make the reasonable choice. Jake felt his anger building like a fire in his chest. The general was so confident that humans would surrender that he was already planning their conquest. The arrogance was staggering. Another chime sounded. 7 minutes left. Emperor Zalthek leaned forward on his throne, his crystalline features showing what might have been amusement. His Supreme Majesty observes that humans appear to be a slow-thinking species, Veltar translated. Perhaps this is why you have achieved so little compared to the great civilizations of the galaxy. That was the final insult. Jake had listened to hours of flowery speeches and veiled threats. He had endured being called primitive and unreasonable. He had watched these aliens plan the conquest of his people while pretending to offer mercy, but calling humans slow-thinking was too much. Jake stood up from his chair slowly, his movements deliberate and controlled. The entire throne room fell silent as every eye turned to watch him. Your Majesty, Jake said, his voice carrying clearly across the vast chamber, I think it's time we had an honest conversation. Jake walked slowly toward the crystal table that sat between the human delegation and Emperor Zolthek's throne. Every step echoed in the silent throne room. The Zephyrian courtiers watched him with growing confusion. This was not part of their careful protocol. Captain Morrison, please sit down, Amy whispered urgently behind him. You're breaking protocol. Jake ignored her. He had spent the last 3 hours listening to the Zephyrians talk about human inferiority while they planned to enslave his entire species. Protocol could go to hell. Your Majesty, Jake said as he reached the sacred table. I've been thinking about what you said, about humans being slow-thinking, about us being primitive compared to great civilizations like yours. Emperor Zalthek's skin shifted to a curious shade of green. He had not expected the human to approach the sacred table without permission. Veltar looked nervous as he prepared to translate. His Supreme Majesty wonders why the human representative has left his assigned position. The translator said carefully. Jake placed his hands on the crystal table. The surface was smooth and warm to the touch, and he could see strange patterns of light moving deep within the crystal itself. The table really was beautiful, he had to admit. It was also a symbol of everything wrong with the Zephyrian Empire. I'm here because I want to make sure you understand something important, Jake said, looking directly at the Emperor. You keep calling us primitive. You keep saying we're slow-thinking. You act like we should be grateful that you're willing to make us your slaves instead of just killing us all. The Emperor's skin darkened to purple again. Several courtiers made alarmed sounds. General Kethmore stepped forward, his metallic skin gleaming with anger. The human shows disrespect to his Supreme Majesty, Kethmore said in heavily accented English. Perhaps he needs to be taught proper behavior. Jake turned to look at the general. You want to teach me something? Go ahead and try. Amy was on her feet now, moving toward Jake. Captain, please, you're making this worse. Carl Bennett was frantically flipping through his notes, looking for some cultural reference that might explain Jake's behavior to the aliens. Lisa Hayes had her hand near her sidearm, ready for whatever was about to happen. Jake pulled out the chair that had been provided for him during the negotiations. It was made of the same golden material as everything else in the throne room, carved with intricate designs and probably worth more than most human starships. You know what I think? Jake said as he positioned the chair next to the crystal table. I think you've forgotten what it means to deal with someone who isn't afraid of you. He sat down in the chair and looked around the throne room at all the elaborate decorations, all the symbols of Zephyrian power and wealth. Then he looked back at Emperor Zolthek, who was watching him with growing alarm. Here's the thing about humans, Jake said conversationally. We don't kneel. We never have. And we never will. You can threaten us, you can try to scare us, you can even kill us, but you cannot make us bow. With deliberate slowness, Jake lifted his right boot and placed it on the crystal table. The reaction was immediate and explosive. Every Zephyrian in the throne room recoiled as if they had been physically struck. Emperor Zolthek's skin flashed. Through a spectrum of colors, from purple to red to white, several courtiers cried out in their musical language. Guards who had been hidden along the walls suddenly appeared, moving toward Jake with weapons that looked like crystalline spears. Stop, Jake said calmly, placing his second boot on the table and leaning back in his chair. Before you do something, you'll regret. Let me finish what I was saying. General Kethmore was shouting orders in the Zephyrian language. His skin had turned a deep bronze color that probably meant he was furious beyond words. The guards hesitated, looking between the general and the emperor for guidance. Veltar was trembling as he spoke. The human has committed the greatest sacrilege possible. He has defiled the sacred table of negotiations. The penalty is immediate execution. Jake kept his feet firmly planted on the crystal surface. Execute me if you want. But first, listen to what I have to say, because I think you need to understand who you're really dealing with. Emperor Zolthek raised one crystalline hand, and the guards stopped their advance. The ruler's voice was cold with rage as he spoke. His Supreme Majesty demands to know why the human has chosen to die in such a dishonorable way, Veltar translated. Jake smiled. It was not a pleasant smile. I'm not planning to die today, Your Majesty. But I'm planning to teach you something about humans that you obviously don't understand. Amy had reached Jake's side and was tugging at his sleeve. Captain, please. Take your feet down and apologize. Maybe we can still fix this. There's nothing to fix, Amy, Jake said without taking his eyes off the Emperor. These people never intended to negotiate with us. They brought us here to watch us surrender. Well, I've got news for them. He leaned forward in his chair, his boots still firmly planted on the sacred table. You want to know what makes humans different from all those other species you've conquered? We're crazy. We do things that don't make sense. We fight when we should surrender. We keep going when any reasonable person would give up. General Kethmore spoke again, his voice full of contempt. The human speaks of madness as if it were a virtue. Sometimes it is, Jake replied. You've been planning this whole thing, haven't you? You probably spent months deciding exactly how to humiliate us. You figured we'd listen to your threats? Realize how outgunned we are, and meekly accept whatever terms you offered. The Emperor's skin was still flashing through angry colors, but Jake noticed that the ruler was listening carefully to every word. But here's what you didn't consider, Jake continued. While you were planning your fancy ceremony and practicing your threatening speeches, we were getting ready for war. Real war. The kind where people die and ships get blown apart and nobody cares about protocol. Carl Bennett looked up from his notes with surprise. Jake, what are you talking about? Jake finally took his eyes off the Emperor to look at his team. Tell them, Carl. Tell them what you found in the intelligence reports before we left Earth. Carl hesitated, then opened his tablet and began reading. Intelligence suggests that the Zephyrian Empire is facing internal problems. 3 client. Species have attempted rebellions in the past year. The Korvan Republic has been building ships in secret. The Talon Confederation has been refusing to pay tribute. Keep going, Jake said. There are reports of food shortages on several Zephyrian worlds. Their military is spread thin, trying to control over 200 star systems. Some analysts believe the Empire is weaker than it appears. Jake turned back to Emperor Zolthek. Surprise, Your Majesty? We're not as stupid as you think we are. We've been watching you, studying you, learning about your weaknesses, and you know what we discovered? The Emperor's skin had turned a pale gray color that Jake had not seen before. It might have been fear or confusion or both. We discovered that you need this war more than we do, Jake said. Your empire is falling apart, your client species are rebelling, your people are hungry. You need to conquer someone new to prove you're still strong. You need our resources to keep your economy going. You need a victory to show your enemies that the Zephyrian Empire is still unbeatable. General Kethmer stepped forward, his spear-like weapon raised. The human lies, the Empire is stronger than ever. Jake laughed. Is that why you've only sent 50 ships to the Kepler sector? Is that why you're trying to scare us into surrendering instead of just attacking? If you're so strong, why aren't you already occupying our colonies? The general's weapon wavered slightly. Jake had hit close to the truth. Here's what's really going on, Jake said, settling back in his chair with his feet still on the table. You can't afford a real war with this. You need us to surrender so you can claim victory without having to fight. But if we refuse to surrender, if we force you to fight, it's going to cost you more than you can afford. Emperor Zolthek spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. His Supreme Majesty asks what the human wants, Veltar translated. Jake smiled. Again, and this time it was genuine. Now we're getting somewhere. What I want, Your Majesty, is a real negotiation. Between equals, no more of this superior species nonsense. No more threats about making us slaves. You want something from us and we want something from you. Let's figure out a deal that works for everyone. The ceremonial bell chimed in. The 10 minutes were up, so what's it going to be? Jake asked, his boots still firmly planted on the sacred crystal table. Are we going to talk like civilized beings, or are we going to see who's really stronger? The throne room remained frozen in silence for several long moments. Emperor Zolthek stared at Jake with his large black eyes, while the human captain kept his boots firmly planted on the sacred crystal table. The other Zephyrians looked to their ruler for guidance, but the Emperor seemed unable to decide what to do. General Kethmer broke the silence first. Your Majesty, this insult cannot be tolerated. The human must be executed immediately, and we must proceed with the invasion of their colonies. Jake kept his eyes fixed on the Emperor. Go ahead, General. Order your invasion. But ask yourself this first. How many ships can you afford to lose? How many of your people can you afford to have die in a war that doesn't need to happen? The Emperor's skin shifted through several colors before settling on a pale silver. When he spoke, his voice was quieter than before. The human claims to know the true state of the Empire, Veltar translated. His Supreme Majesty wishes to know what proof exists for these accusations. Jake reached into his uniform pocket and pulled out a small data tablet. Several guards moved forward, but the Emperor raised his hand to stop them. This tablet contains intelligence reports gathered by human agents over the past 6 months. Jake said, I'm sure your own advisors have told you the same things, but maybe you haven't been listening. He activated the tablet and began reading. Food riots on Zephyr Prime lasted for 3 days before Imperial forces restored order. The Corvan Republic has refused to send tribute for 8 months and is building a fleet of warships. The Talon Confederation has declared independence and is forming an alliance with 2 other client species. Jake looked up from the tablet. Should I continue? I have reports about mining strikes, transport disruptions, and military units refusing. Orders to suppress rebellions. Emperor Zolthek's skin turned a deeper shade of silver. He spoke to General Kethmer in their musical language, and the general's response was sharp and defensive. The general says these reports are lies spread by enemies of the Empire, Veltar translated reluctantly. Are they? Jake asked. Then why haven't you attacked our colonies already? You've had 3 months to do it. Your fleet is huge and powerful. According to you, what are you waiting for? Amy was still standing beside Jake's chair, looking terrified but determined to support her captain. Sir, maybe we should be more diplomatic about this. Diplomacy is what got us into this mess, Jake replied. These people don't respect diplomacy, they respect strength. Carl Bennett had been studying the Emperor's color changes throughout the conversation. Captain, I think His Majesty is actually considering what you're saying. The silver coloration seems to indicate deep thought or uncertainty. Jake nodded and turned back to the Emperor. Your Majesty, I'm going to tell you something that your advisors probably won't. You don't need to conquer humanity to solve your problems. In fact, conquering us might make things worse. The Emperor leaned forward on his crystal throne, showing interest for the first time since the negotiations began. Think about it, Jake continued. If you attack our colonies, we fight back. Even if you win, which isn't guaranteed, you'll lose ships and soldiers you can't spare. Your other enemies will see that the Empire is busy fighting humans, and they'll use that opportunity to cause more trouble. General Kethmer spoke again, but this time his voice was less confident than before. The general maintains that the Imperial fleet is strong enough to handle any rebellion, Veltar translated. Maybe it is, Jake said. But why take the risk? Why not try a different approach? He finally removed his feet from the crystal table and leaned forward in his chair. What if instead of making us your enemies, you made us your allies? The suggestion caused an immediate uproar among the Zephyrian courtiers. Several of them spoke at once, their voices rising in what sounded like outrage. The Emperor raised his hand for silence. His Supreme Majesty finds this suggestion unusual, Veltar translated. The Empire does not form alliances with lesser species. Then maybe it's time to start, Jake said. You need resources to feed your people and maintain your fleet. We need security and access to galactic trade routes. Instead of fighting over the Kepler sector, why don't we share it? Jake stood up and walked around the crystal table, moving closer to the Emperor's throne. The guards tensed, but did not move to stop him. Here's what I'm proposing, Jake said. Joint mining operations in the Kepler sector, with profits split between our species. Human colonies remain under human administration, but we establish Zephyrian trade posts and cultural centers. In exchange, the Empire provides military protection for human ships and settlements. Emperor Zalthek's skin shifted to a new color that Jake had not seen before, a pale gold that seemed to glow with its own light. Furthermore, Jake continued, if any of your client species try to rebel, we help you maintain order. Human ships are fast and maneuverable. Human soldiers are experienced fighters. We could be useful allies in keeping your empire stable. General Kethmer's skin had turned a dark bronze color, indicating his displeasure with the direction of the conversation. The Empire has never needed help from primitive species, he said in broken English. Pride comes before the fall, General, Jake replied. Smart leaders know when to accept help, even from people they consider inferior. Emperor Zalthek spoke, and his words were longer and more thoughtful than any of his previous statements. His Supreme Majesty acknowledges that the human proposal has certain merits, Veltar translated carefully. However, he questions whether humans can be trusted to honor such an agreement, Jake smiled. That's a fair question. But ask yourself this, which is more trustworthy? A species that surrenders out of fear, or a species that's willing to fight for what it believes in? He gestured toward the crystal table where his boot prints were still visible on the sacred surface. I just committed what you consider the worst possible crime, and I did it knowing you could execute me for it. Does that seem like the action of someone who breaks promises easily? The Emperor studied Jake for a long moment, his skin cycling through several different colors. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a new tone of respect. His Supreme Majesty says that humans are indeed a strange species, Veltar translated. You show disrespect in the most sacred places, yet you speak of honor and alliance. You commit crimes punishable by death, yet you offer partnership. Jake nodded. We're complicated, I'll give you that. but we're also loyal to our friends and dangerous to our enemies. The question is, which one do you want us to be? Emperor Zolthak stood up from his crystal throne. He was even taller than Jake had expected, nearly 8 feet in height, and his crystalline skin now glowed with a warm golden light. His Supreme Majesty will consider the human proposal, Veltar translated. But first there is the matter of the sacrilege committed against the sacred table of negotiations. Jake tensed, ready for whatever punishment the Emperor might decree. He had known the risks when he put his feet on the table, and he was prepared to face the consequences, but the Emperor's next words surprised everyone in the throne room. His Supreme Majesty declares that the sacred table has been redefined, Veltar translated with obvious confusion. It is no longer merely a symbol of Zephyrian authority. It has become a symbol of honest negotiation between species who respect each other's strength. General Kethmar made a sound that might have been a gasp or a protest, but the Emperor continued speaking. Furthermore, His Supreme Majesty wishes to propose a new protocol for future negotiations. Representatives of allied species will be permitted to express themselves freely during discussions. Jake felt a grin spreading across his face. The Emperor was not only pardoning his breach of protocol, but making it an official part of Zephyrian diplomatic procedure. His Supreme Majesty also wishes to invite Captain Morrison to return in 1 month for formal treaty negotiations, Veltar continued. The human delegation will be given full diplomatic status and treated as representatives of an independent allied nation. Amy let out a breath she had been holding for what felt like hours. Carl Bennett was frantically taking notes, documenting this historic moment. Lisa Hayes had a smile on her face that Jake had not seen since before the war began. The massive doors at the far end of the throne room began to open, but this time it was a sign of welcome rather than imprisonment. Jake walked back to the crystal table and placed his hand on its surface one more time. Your Majesty, I think this is the beginning of a very interesting friendship. Emperor Zolthak's skin glowed brighter with golden light as he replied. His Supreme Majesty agrees, Veltar translated, and he looks forward to learning more about the strange and stubborn species called humanity. As the human delegation prepared to leave the throne room, Jake paused at the crystal table and looked back at the Emperor one final time. By the way, Your Majesty, he said with a grin, next time we meet, I promise to keep my feet on the floor. The Emperor's response was translated as dignified laughter, a sound like wind chimes mixed with distant thunder. The peace talks had indeed ended when the human put his feet on the Emperor's table. But instead of ending in war, they had ended in the most unlikely alliance the galaxy had ever seen.